Podcast. See what's on your mind. It's the Treatable Podcast. Real, coming, treatable. It's the Treatable Podcast. It's all on the Treatable Podcast.
Generational trauma is a trending phrase in the mental health space right now. But how does it work? How can the exact same kind of trauma follow you and your family members down the family tree, generation after generation? What are some of the consequences of generational trauma? And most importantly, how can you heal so that you don't pass it on to the next generation? Welcome to the Treatable Podcast with me, Clint Malley, your host. Today, we're unpacking the fascinating topic that is generational trauma. We have an amazing guest for you here today, Melody Murray. Melody is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a child mental health specialist in private practice counseling. With her master's degree in clinical psychology from Antioch University, Melody specializes in childhood emotional neglect and its effects on adult behavior and dysfunction. Melody has a unique background. She's a former comedian who's left a lucrative career as a reality TV producer and director to work in mental health. She went back to school and then obtained her master's degree in clinical psychology from Antioch University. And then today, Melody has a debut nonfiction book, Mourning the Living When the Loved One You've Lost is Still Here. And her second project is a workbook, My Bounce Back Plan, Designing Your Own Healing Formula, which is going to be released this year, 2024.
Treatable Podcast. It's all on the Treatable Podcast.
So, Melody, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, Clint, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for reaching out.
Okay. Generational trauma, let's have a working definition. When you're trying to describe generational trauma to the everyday person, where do you start? How do you describe it?
I believe generational trauma it's all the stuff that your ancestors either didn't or couldn't heal, and it got passed on to you, got passed on to your parents. And if you don't work on healing yourself, you're going to pass it on to your children and grandchildren. It's all the pain points. It's the assaults, the abuse, things that, natural disasters. It's all of those hard things that are just held within and don't get processed out. And then all of the symptoms of those unhealed traumas, they just trickle down if you don't heal yourself.
If you were to give somebody some practical examples when they're trying to understand generational trauma, what are some of your go-to ones that you would use?
Addiction, where let's say you've got a grandfather that is an alcoholic, and then your father or mother becomes an addict, and then you or your siblings then also take that on, and a substance becomes your coping mechanism. That is generational trauma right there, where you're not paying attention to the things that you're using that are actually harming yourself, or the things that have been done, and they keep being transferred on to generation after generation. And then the cycle just continues because no one is being honest with themselves or in healing.
Yeah. And when I think about generations, we think about Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z. They all have their own unique historical things that have happened to them, whether it's the country that they're living in or the government, the environment. How much is environment a role player when it comes to trauma, generational trauma for folks?
So much. The conversation for so long has always been nature versus nurture. And what's happening within your environment is a huge indicator of how you're going to turn out, how you are going to handle things in life, the good stuff, but especially the bad. And I feel that what's happening right now in our country and our society, there are many good things that are happening. There are things that we can look at that are negatives, but I think a very positive thing is so many big name people, so many celebrities are coming forward and talking about their mental health struggles and what they're doing to handle those things. I think that's amazing. In previous years, nobody was talking about those things. And I think it's extremely important because we're all humans having a human experience. And that means that there are going to be bumps in the road, and you have to work on yourself so that your life can be better. And especially if you decide that you want to be a parent. I say that to my clients all the time. And I just say it in general whenever I'm having conversations with people. If you want to be a mess up, if you want to screw up, if you want to be a fuck up, feel free. If you want to have children, nope, you got to heal yourself or you're going to pass on your crap to them.
Yeah. And when we say pass on, how does this pass on genetically? Does this pass on just in our patterns of thinking and the routines that we establish that our kids pick up on? When we see pass on, how does generational trauma actually pass on? What do you mean by that?
It's every single thing you mentioned is a way that trauma gets passed on. And so let's just talk about medical things. Hypertension, you'll find
Mm,
that within the family lines. Post traumatic stress disorder, we are all familiar with fight, flight, freeze.
mhm,
And that came from caveman days, like thousands of years ago. We understand that if you're in a really tough moment, you're going to either freeze up, not move, you're going to try to fight off whatever is harming you, or you're going to fight and run. We're all familiar with those things, but something has been lost when let's just talk about war. Let's talk about slavery. Slavery in America, the wounds of trauma have been detected in the DNA of African Americans in America. And so many people want to deny that. But how do you deny something that just happened a few hundred years ago, but you will
mhm.
accept what happened thousands of years ago? It sounds silly when you put it that way, but there are people that deny that the anxiety and the fear that were in the slaves when they were kidnapped from Africa and brought to America, it's still in the DNA of African Americans to this day. It just is. And responses and reactions to things, they still remain. And if we don't address those things, then they plague us. And that, unfortunately, is what's happened within my community, where, heightened emotions and heightened reactions to things. And unfortunately, within my community, there's still stigma attached to seeking mental health treatment. And it's not just in mine, it's in so many others where people feel that only quote unquote crazy people go to therapy. And it's so sad that there are people that are suffering unnecessarily with addictions, with health issues, with anxiety, depression, and so many other things. And they're not seeking out help because they don't want to be labeled without realizing that you can seek out help and no one needs to know. It can be your own little secret. And the ripple effect of feeling better makes everyone better. Your coworkers, your neighbors, your children, everyone feels the ripple effect of healing, just like we feel the ripple effect of pain. We feel that too when it comes to, let's just say, mass shootings. Someone who goes out and harms a bunch of people, it's because of something personal that's happened, but they're sharing it with a group of people and everyone feels that ripple effect. The opposite is also true. When you heal yourself, that the beauty of healing and the peace that comes from that is also a beautiful ripple effect that could happen, that could affect people for the better.
Yeah, so this makes me think about a few things. What you said made me think about epigenetics.
Yep.
Basically, there are certain biomedical things in your body. And when we talked about, we had our episode on autoimmune disorders, there are certain things that are turned on and turned off based upon stress or based upon ways that you heal things. And just like you can go through a situation and activate things within your body, you can also deactivate these things. That's epigenetics in a nutshell. But one of the things that you mentioned was you identify with the Black community, as you mentioned, and you talked about there's a stigma with mental health in the Black community. But to me, when I think about that, it makes a lot of sense that there's a mistrust of systems, right? When you've been systemically oppressed, when there's systemic racism and systemic slavery and all of the different ways in which Black folks have been systemically oppressed, and you have a whole other system that is the behavioral health field, it makes sense why you would distrust that because distrusting helped you survive. And I wonder, just like you mentioned, how we can't choose to fight, flight, or freeze, meaning that it's programmed within our DNA. How does somebody go about recognizing what is generational trauma versus personal trauma? And then once you've recognized that, is there a difference in the way that you approach healing from that?
Thank you so much for everything you just said, Clint. You were so spot on. I think it's really important to be honest with yourself. I think that is the key to all of it. And taking some time to pay attention to family patterns is extremely important. One of the things I do with my clients when they want to look at generational trauma is we create a genogram. And a genogram is basically it's the family tree that everybody creates when they're in elementary school. So it looks exactly the same. So you've got your parents and your grandparents and your great grandparents, and then all the children that, each set of parents created. But it goes a step further than birth date, death date, and how many children are involved. It goes to relationship patterns. Where was the substance abuse? Was there physical, sexual abuse? All of those things get tracked. And I think that what it does is it helps people lessen the shame that they feel when they see that they're behaving a certain way that they don't like. But it calls for honesty. You've got to be honest about where you come from and what you know in order to fix it, in order to heal it. And I have to, pull back when I use the word fix because I don't believe that any of us are broken. I believe that if we're walking, talking, seeing, there's still an opportunity for us to heal and to feel better. We're not broken, but there is a way that you can change the trajectory of your family line all on your own based on your own personal healing. And, your own personal trauma is the things that you remember, the things that you have personally experienced. And the generational trauma is paying attention to how you respond to certain things. Do you notice that when something big happens, do you shut down? And did you notice that your mom or your dad would shut down and they would stop talking? And did your grandparents shut down? You really have to look at your family tree and look at what did you inherit. It goes beyond hair texture and eye color and height and athletic prowess. We inherit so many things. There's a really great book called Emotional Inheritance, and it talks about there's a way that you can feel and move throughout life that may not even be attached to your own personal trauma. And that was tracked to, I'm not exactly sure of all of the origins, but in the book, they talk about Holocaust survivors, where there are descendants from the Holocaust that have severe levels of anxiety and they haven't suffered any personal traumas, but they were raised with people who had anxiety, heightened anxiety that wasn't healed for whatever reason. And so it calls for you to really pay attention to how do you feel from day to day? What are your thoughts from day to day? Are you more positive or are you more pessimistic? It calls for you to be really, really honest with yourself in order to change things. And it is possible to change. It is possible to improve and just feel better. But you have to be honest with yourself in order to do so.
This episode of Treatable is brought to you by Sandstone Care, which helps teens, young adults, and their families overcome challenges with mental health, substance use, and addiction. They provide age-specific, individualized treatment plans centered around your unique situation and goals, and they only use evidence-based therapies to help you get there. They keep their group therapy sizes small so folks can connect with others going through the same struggle and so that you never feel alone. They also give academic and vocational support to help you improve your grades or to get started on your career path. And lastly, because they know that mental health and substance use affect the people closest to us, they provide support for the whole family through their family therapy program. To learn more about teen and young adult treatment options, go to sandstonecare.com. Change is possible, and Sandstone Care is here to help. Yeah, I think we've talked about on this show many times the role of mirror neurons. As infants, we're constantly looking to our caregivers to try and figure out how to feel, how to be in a situation. We co-regulate, right? We regulate our emotions with our caregivers. And one, if your caregiver is not aware of the stress that they have, the depression that they have, maybe they didn't have a name for it. Maybe they didn't have somebody who was being able to put the pieces together and to see the patterns. Then whether or not they liked it, they were passing on these different things to you. You were absorbing it like a sponge. As a child, you have to take in the stimulus from your parents. And so that stuff's going to happen. Most parents are just doing the best they can, and they're
Mhm.
parenting the way that they were parented and the way that they know and what helped them survive. And so they're passing on those things to you. And so, just kind of summarizing some of what you're saying, number one, notice patterns in your family. You do this by, what was the term you used, you create with clients? A genogram, where you
Mhm.
notice patterns from your family, and then you pay attention to how you respond to certain challenges or changes and see if that's in line with how your family is responding. And usually we're thinking about like negative coping mechanisms. What are the things that you do that, if repeated over your lifetime, are going to produce a net negative effect, right?
Mhm.
Compared to like positive coping mechanisms that are more regenerative and that build you up and that help you live a happier, healthier life. Now, I'm thinking of a lot of people who don't feel super connected with their genogram. Maybe they took a DNA test, maybe they had a really strong family network, but maybe they didn't. Maybe their family history is more fragmented, especially when you think about big world events and war and how families become displaced and diaspora and how we lose records of these people.
Mhm.
How does somebody go about that journey if they don't know their great grandparents or they never spent time with them or their parents don't tell these stories? What do you do in that case?
Lean on your current relationships. What are your friends saying? If you have a series of relationship breakups and your ex partners have all said the same things, there's an opportunity there. So instead of being automatically defensive, look into it and just wonder, get curious about yourself. I think that so many of us can be judgmental and really, really critical, and that can be something that's inherited as well. Whenever I talk to my clients, with certain clients, I'll say that your parents instilled something in you and you've picked up the baton and you keep running with it, which is very appropriate when it comes to the Olympics. Somebody's running a race and they slap a baton in your hand and you run the same race. And let's just talk survival mode. So many people stay in survival mode years or decades beyond those moments where they had to survive. And you just don't realize it because it's just that space where you function in this heightened, way of living. The session that I had right before our podcast, I was talking to a client of mine that just had a baby. The baby's a month old and she is still running, 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 doing all these things. And she treats everything in her life like a game of whack-a-mole, where I've got to be on top of everything. All of these things she's got to prepare and be proactive. And she thinks that it's helping her to constantly be doing. She had to function that way with her low functioning parents. They dumped so many things on her in her childhood, but she's 40 years old now. And she's still functioning the way she did when she was 10 and 15 and 18 in their household. They didn't know that they were burdening her with their own crap. They didn't know. And so as I'm talking to clients, one of the things I say to them is like, I'm not trying to beat up your parents. They did the best they could with what they knew. People can't teach you what they weren't taught. People can't give you what they didn't receive from their own parents. But you've got to pay attention to what your patterns are. If you notice that you keep dating the same type of person, if you notice you have the same grievances at work, if you notice that you've got an addictive personality, just pay attention to what you personally know about your life history so far. And that's all you need. Because you brought up something really key. What if you've got someone who was adopted and they don't know their family history, somebody that grew up in foster care and all they know is the traumatic stuff? It's not just trauma that gets passed down, strengths get passed down too. And so you
Mm.
got to hold on to those things too. There are good things that people will give you. So it's important to not focus on all the negatives and all the bad things that you inherited. You inherited some good stuff too. So make sure that you try to be as balanced as possible as you're doing this dive. You inherited great things that have you still living and moving and breathing and contributing to Earth right here, right now. But you get to decide if you want to heal certain things that haven't worked out in your favor or certain patterns you just don't like. But you've got to be honest with yourself and try not to be so critical and judgmental with yourself. Try not to take on that baton of judgment and criticism. Be patient with yourself. Be kind to yourself. Be gentle with yourself as you're exploring and lead with curiosity. And instead of beating yourself up and go, God, I'm so stupid, or what the hell is wrong with me? Go, I wonder why I do that. I wonder why I keep dating the same type of person. Why am I attracted to this type of job? Why do I always drink whenever I'm super stressed out? Why do I always drink? Why do I go shopping? Why am I on Amazon at 3:00 every morning? Why? Just get curious. Just get curious with yourself, but be patient and loving with yourself as you're doing that work so that you can just figure out why you do certain things and then dismantle those things. Slowly dismantle those things and give yourself the patience to figure out why. And then figure out how you're going to take out those negative responses, those things that you don't like to do, and then replace them with things that are healthier.
I heard it said one time that if you could teach your children anything, it would be that would never go out of style, that would never be irrelevant with the use of AI. It would be the ability to notice patterns, repeat patterns, and create patterns, right? Because if you think about it, if I'm able to notice a pattern, it's the stages of learning. If I'm able to notice a pattern, I'm able to see how things work. I'm curious about it, to your point. The second thing is if I'm able to repeat a pattern, then it's like following a recipe. I'm able to follow the steps to get the desired outcome. And then once I'm able to repeat a pattern, I'm now able to be creative and to do a new type of pattern. And though that's often used for learning and it's a skill that we can use with personal development, the same holds true within understanding our mental health. The first thing we have to do is notice the patterns that are already taking place. And then connected with that is see which patterns are being repeated. So to your point with generational trauma, is this a theme? Is this something that is happening over and over and over again within your own life, within the significant relationships that you have, and even within your parents and their parents? And then once you've understood those things, you now have an opportunity to go and to create some new patterns. And you're able to say, okay, I've seen the way that this has worked out for me, the benefits of how it has helped my parents or myself survive in situations, because all of this stuff, even though there might not be ideal, it's helped you survive. Otherwise, it wouldn't be passed on. To your point, there are strengths and there are detriments to most survival skills or survival mechanisms, coping mechanisms. And it's important to understand both and to not beat yourself up about it. One of the things I wanted to ask you a question, I was just having a conversation with a friend last night. She was talking about her father, who's an alcoholic, and the impact that it's had on her and feeling angry. And so in a form, we kind of have some generational trauma. And one of the things that we were talking about is like forgiveness and how hard it is to be able to forgive in those situations. What do you do and how do you help clients when they're recognizing a form of generational trauma that's been a pattern? They've seen it happen and they might even be repeating that pattern. And it's not serving their life. It's not making their life better. And they feel like they've missed out on a childhood or an upbringing that, other people might have had. How do you go about forgiving those folks?
Forgiving is tricky and it takes time. And it's not something that I ever push on people automatically. And a lot of people do that. A lot of people, that will be their automatic thing. You got to forgive. You got to forgive. Yes, you have to forgive, but you can't forgive and you can't move on until you acknowledge that there was an issue. A lot of people jump over that and you have to validate your experience first. So many people will beat themselves up because they haven't just let something go. I should let it go. I know I should let it go. If you haven't acknowledged how this something has affected you, how it's impacted you, how it's formed you as a human being. So I stress, you got to be angry. You got to acknowledge that there's an issue and you have to let yourself be angry, but you're not going to stay angry. And I have to say that point. You're going to have to allow yourself to be angry because anger in a lot of ways is a protection. It lets you know something wrong has happened. It's necessary, but you can't stay there. So you have to allow yourself to say, this thing happened, it occurred and it affected me and it shaped me and it formed me in a way that I don't like. I do things that I don't like. But I've got to look at who was the perpetrator. Where did they come from? What were they taught? And then realize that some people just suck and they're horrible people. And some people just don't know any better. But you have to move on for you. And forgiveness doesn't mean you have to call that person up and say, I forgive you for abusing me. You don't have to do it, but you can do it within your own heart to say, I'm not going to let this thing be in charge of me anymore. I'm not going to let this thing be in control of how I interact with people. And most importantly, how I interact with myself. And it can be a very empowering move. Say, I'm letting this go. I know that you couldn't give me what I needed. You couldn't protect me the way I wanted. You weren't protected. So how are you going to protect me? You couldn't even protect yourself. So there has to be these deep conversations that you have with yourself. That's where the honesty comes in. You have to be honest and allow yourself to feel. But it's unfair to just automatically jump to, I'm going to forgive. And I'm not saying that you have to forgive. A lot of people feel that that's an automatic thing you have to do. Not necessarily. I talk about this in my book, Mourning the Living, when the loved one you've lost is still here. You don't necessarily have to, because not everybody is going to understand how much they've harmed you. And I truly believe that most people wouldn't harm you if they knew how much they were harming you. People are just flying blind in so many ways. They don't know the ripple effect of their behaviors. But forgiveness is very, very powerful, so that you're not allowing this thing or these things that happen to you to be in complete control of your identity.
Yeah. This reminds me of the stages of grief. So, anger is one of those stages of grief. So, just a quick reminder, the stages of grief, we have denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, right? But anger is a key part of that. And so, one of the things I think that is important to notice is that if you're looking at your family and you're looking at a loved one, and as you mentioned, they're not dead, they're alive, and they've let you down in some sort of way. I think an important thing to think about is that in a way, your anger is a part of the grieving process. You're grieving the childhood that you never had. You are grieving the person that you might have been had you had a secure attachment and a loving family, or maybe things completely outside of your parents' controls, like war, like circumstances with racism, like economic deprivation, and the things that were contextual that you actually didn't even know about or completely out. Your whole life was different. And that anger is a part of that grieving process. So when I think about those stages of denial and anger and bargaining, like we think about an anxious attachment style, I'm somebody who's trying to placate my caregiver or do things so that they'll pay attention to me and notice me and love me. Like these are all part of the grieving process. And but to your point, it only comes about when we've actually been able to like notice it and that this is a feeling that's happening there. So I wanted to ask you another question about accepting the good and the bad, right? So I think that, and specifically, this is a really helpful thing with, as you mentioned, grieving a loved one who hasn't passed away. You have a rocky relationship with people within your family, and you realize that it's had an impact on you negatively and the patterns of behavior and thoughts and emotions that you carried on into your life. How do you go about separating the good and the bad? And why is that so hard to do sometimes?
It definitely takes time to do it. And the bad is what stings. That is what is top of mind, the bad. And you have to grieve it and you've got to be angry about it. It takes more time to balance the scales by looking at what are the good things that came from this person or from this situation. So I can make it personal with my mother. My mother was a drug addict and she was very abusive. And we moved from house to house to house, and it was a very unstable, chaotic childhood. And so I was angry for a very long time for all the obvious things I was angry about. But I didn't even know I was angry. And the problem with anger is that men are allowed to be angry, but women are not allowed to be angry. And so it's very difficult for women to get in touch with that space because we're told that we're supposed to be pretty or sexy, but you can't be angry because then you're a bitch and then you get, all the stuff that comes from those titles. So The balance is necessary because we're not all just one thing. Nobody is all bad. Nobody is all good and nobody is all bad. And I like to think of a quilt. When you think of a quilt, there are multiple squares on a quilt and there's different patterns and different colors, but our whole life is not just one square. There's a bunch of squares, there's a bunch of experiences. And so it's important to even out your picture of a person so that you can, especially if it's a parent or a grandparent, know that you're not all bad. You didn't come from all bad. You came from someone, maybe they can run fast, maybe they're really creative. You've got to balance it out in order to maintain a positive sense of self. And again, I don't believe that if people truly understood the repercussions of their behaviors, so many people wouldn't do so many harmful things. They don't think about the ripple effect of what they're doing and how it's going to play out in somebody else's life. They're just surviving. So many people are functioning from survival mode, again, years after they have to be. There's so many coping mechanisms that we develop when we're very young that work when you're little, but when you get older, that'll put you in jail. You can't have a temper tantrum at 25. You'll end up in prison. Or, the excessive eating or the running away, those kind of things. There's so many things that you can't do as an adult that you could do as a child. And as you're trying to come to terms with your grief about a person or a situation that you had no control over, but you feel all the pain because of it, you've got to balance it out. But isn't necessarily something you have to do right out of the gate, because you've got to get in touch with the pain point. And that is something that's difficult for a lot of people to even say, I was harmed by this person that was supposed to love and protect me. That is a hard thing for a lot of people to say, but you need to say it. And why it's so difficult is because I call them like moral injuries. Your parents are supposed to be the people that love you more than anybody and protect you more than anybody. But if they're the ones that harm you, that's a brain scramble. That's a really hard thing to acknowledge. And so a lot of people just deny it. And they show up at Thanksgiving or Christmas every year next to their abuser with a plastic smile on their face, and they're dying inside. So I think that when you're in your healing process, you need to allow for space. You need to create boundaries, and you need to create some space and allow yourself to just feel all that stuff. Whether you do it on your own, you do it in therapy, or you do it with a trusted loved one, you've got to feel it all. And then slowly you get to forgiveness. Slowly you get to that place where you're like, you know what? I inherited my intelligence. She used it for evil and not good. I'm using it for good. You have to give yourself time. You've got to be patient and not rush through it, and know that there are times when you're going to show up and you're going to love the way you respond to a certain situation. And some days you're going to be really, really annoyed about how you react to a situation. And you've got to just take it slow and be patient with yourself. Patience is extremely key as you're healing, and knowing that not everybody wants to heal. That was a really hard thing for me to understand as I went through therapy. And then as I became a therapist, I had to realize that healing is not important for a lot of people. It's not a goal for a lot of people. And so that is something that is also very wounding, when you realize that I'm doing things to make my life better and hopefully my family line. And like, you don't care? This doesn't bother you that this is what's our pattern? And the anger that's involved in that, I have that towards my older sister. Where it's like, you keep doing the same dumb stuff and you see the result of it and you're not doing anything to change it. Allow yourself to have those moments, but then you're going to have to move on and let it go, because healing takes a lot of strength. Acknowledging what you've gone through takes a lot of strength. And a lot of people don't have that. And you've got to understand that some people don't have the resources to go to therapy. They don't have the energy. They don't have the patience to pause and go, what am I feeling? What's going on? A lot of people just don't have it. And that's a sad thing, but it's just our reality. And do what you can, but respect when other people just don't have it the way that you've got it. You've got to respect that. It's not a goal for a lot of people. And as crazy as that sounds, it's just reality.
Yeah, your healing journey is, though it might be interconnected and intergenerational trauma, as we've been talking about, that doesn't mean that everyone is trying to heal from it. And I never thought about the idea that you mentioned that healing takes energy, but it makes a lot of sense. If you're healing from something and say a physical injury, like a really bad physical injury, you have to not do other things. And you mentioned boundaries, you mentioned being able to put up walls or situations that allow you to heal. And I never thought about boundaries in that kind of regard that if I'm somebody who says, okay, I've seen the pattern that's happened in my life, right? Like my family deals with stress and problems this way, and I don't want to do that anymore. That's not something I want to continue. In order for me to be able to make that change, it is going to take more effort. It's going to take new coping skills. It's going to take new neurons that are firing and wiring together. It's a whole other thing. And I'm not going to be able to hold myself to the same standard of, whatever you want to say, performance or showing upness or whatever. And if that's the case, like I have to understand, I have to come into that with a patient mindset that you also mentioned, that I need to understand that this takes time, but it's good and it's not going to be this way forever. And also, not everyone wants to undergo this journey. It's going to be a personal journey for everybody. I wanted to touch on a pushback that people might have when it comes to understanding generational trauma. You talk about your trauma. You see people do this with all kinds of things, even with things that are like really obvious, like systemic racism or whatever. They'll say, these are excuses. You, by focusing on these things, you're focusing on the negative and you're making excuses for your behavior. How do you address that line of thinking? And because even if somebody's not saying that to other people, they might be saying this to themselves, right?
Mhm.
How do you work with clients through that kind of overcome?
Such a great point. In my book, The Bounce Back Plan, the very first step, it's not chapters, it's steps. The very first one is pause. And this is to speak to a point you made before. You've got to slow down and you got to acknowledge that something happened. Something changed in your life, in your world. You've got to slow down. You've got to pause and go, something happened to me. People are so afraid of being considered victims. I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to be a victim. Honey, if you've been harmed, you are a victim. Victim mode is something different. If you're using what happened to you as an excuse not to stand up and be an adult and be a good, thriving person around, your children, your family, your coworkers, whatever, that's being a victim. And that's using your circumstances as an excuse not to have your shit together. You have to acknowledge that something has changed and something has harmed you. That's not being a victim in that negative sense. And so I feel that it's a really sad thing. And I believe it's part of the baton that if you grew up in a space where stuff was happening around you and no one acknowledged that something bad has occurred and it has affected you, it breaks my heart. I
Mm,
grew up in that way where horrible things were happening all the time, but we were supposed to just keep it moving as if nothing was going on. And I took that in my life and I put that on other people. Suck it up, walk it off, because that's what I was taught. And it took someone on the outside giving me the permission to give myself that I can slow down and I can acknowledge that something bad has occurred and it has affected me. We need to do that for ourselves. But it's harder to do when the people that you grew up with don't do it. And that's part of that parental attunement. The perfect thing would be something horrible happens, and then your parent goes, Clint, babe, our house got robbed and all of our stuff got stolen. And we don't know what we're going to do. And honey, how are you? We're trying to figure it out on our end. What are you thinking? How are you feeling? Are you scared? I'm scared. I don't know if they're going to come back. Having those moments, so many of us don't have those moments, and we need to have those moments. And when you didn't have those moments, then you continue that because you start thinking as a child, you think, well, I'm not supposed to have a feeling about this thing that occurred to me. I'm not supposed to respond to it, but you are supposed to respond to it. It's just that the people that grew up, that helped you grow up, the people that were in charge of your environment, didn't acknowledge these things. And so you took that to mean that you're not supposed to acknowledge these things that change your world. You're supposed to acknowledge these things. And so I would say push back on your thoughts that don't support your growth and your healing. Push back and get curious. Why am I putting that on somebody else? Why am I saying that this person that has been hurt, that has been sexually assaulted, that has been robbed, their house got burned down? Why am I saying, oh, walk it off, let it go? Oh, but you have insurance. Oh, just, it's not that big of a deal. Why am I being so dismissive of them? Well, it's probably because someone was dismissive of you.
Yeah, I'm immediately thinking of like an avoidant attachment style in which you were told by your primary caregivers that you need to be strong alone, that feeling feelings is a weakness, and that if you don't have your emotions together, you need to isolate yourself until you do and then come back into the group. And if you grow up in that environment, you're going to also push that on other people, and you're going to be more detached from other people in your emotional relationships. And if you don't know what these attachment styles are, guys, go back and listen to our episode on the 4 attachment styles. It's really important in understanding a lot of early life, the way that we connect with people, understanding trauma, that kind of thing. I wanted to talk about one last thing, and it was a really interesting conversation again I had with a friend yesterday. So she was talking about, she grew up in Israel and among other places, but primarily in Israel. And in her community, the enemy was always Palestinians, right? The enemy was always those Palestinians over there. And there was a movie that was being promoted, and it was about this Romeo and Juliet style situation between an Israeli person and a Palestinian person. And it wasn't until she was able to see this movie that she was able to connect with Palestinian folks or feel a sense of empathy when it came to their situation. And that movie led her on to watch another movie that helped her understand the systemic oppression of the Palestinian people as well. And then from there, she was able to like really have like a holistic grasp, but it was otherwise something that she wasn't able to do. And when you think about stories or you think about movies in general, the best movies are when you understand the motivations behind what we would call the antagonist or usually the villain. And there's actually like a whole genre of movies now in which people do this, right? You think about like Cruella and you think about Maleficent, where the whole theme of the story is to unpack the background of this historically just all bad person. But as you mentioned, nobody is all good or all bad. Like all of us have this complex array of things. When you are thinking and working with clients and helping them to understand the motivations and the survival mechanisms, the things that people in their life have done to survive, how do you go about helping them to tell a more rounded story in which these people who might have a negative pattern or a negative coping mechanism that they passed on to their kids also did it for a really good reason because it helped them survive?
I think that it's important to understand that we are all doing the best that we can at any particular time. And we have to give that grace to other people and to ourselves, especially. And, life can be really, really tough for a lot of people at certain times. And I try to help people understand that when they're coming to therapy, what they're trying to do is discover who they are without all the pain that they've either experienced or that they've seen or the people that raised them with. You're creating yourself. As an adult, you're creating yourself. You're figuring out who you want to be. And it takes time to do that. And you've got to allow yourself to feel all the stuff that goes along with the things that you've experienced. But then there has to come a time when you say, okay, these are the things that occurred. They formed me, but I am not my experiences. I'm not all of my bad experiences. I am what I choose to be. Carl, it's a quote from Carl Jung. We are who we choose to be. And I feel that that's a very empowering, thought. It's an empowering place to be. that you get to decide what your past experiences are going to mean. How do they form your identity? You get to decide. Up until this point, maybe you were blind and you didn't know. But now that the blinders are off, or however you want to describe it, you get to decide how important something is to you. You get to decide. That is a very, very important thing to understand. We get to decide how important something is, how important a moment is. It can mean nothing to us, or it can mean everything. You get to choose. And you get to change your mind. If you used to blow up about this one particular thing all the time, you get to make a new decision. Every day is an opportunity to make a new decision about how you handle a situation. And you can blow up and you can freak out, or you can just shrug things off. You get to decide. And I think that's a really empowering place to be, is when you understand that you can change your mind. And that doesn't need to make sense to everybody around you. And you don't have to issue a press release to say, I used to freak out about this thing. I'm not freaking about this thing anymore. Knowing that you're going to evolve. That's the beauty of healing. You evolve. And that's one of the things I say to my clients all the time. The ones that have never been to therapy before, in the beginning stages, they say, how am I going to know that I'm better? Very simple. Life is cyclical. We typically go through this similar situations over and over and over again. And when you find that you have a new response to this situation and you like the response, that means you're healing. And it's a choice that you've made. It's a choice. You get to decide how important something is in your life. And just because someone else sees something and they want to die on that hill and they want to be a victim to that thing forever, you don't have to do that. You don't have to be that person. I feel that way with my older sister. The victimhood is so strong. We went through the same shit. I chose to live differently because I didn't want to continue the patterns. Now, I didn't realize that when I started my therapy journey. I didn't realize that's what my goal was. And I started my therapy journey with my finger pointed out at my parents and how much they sucked. Because that's all I could handle. I couldn't look at me. I wasn't strong enough to look at me. But years later, I got to the point where I can go, oh man, look what I screwed up. Oh man, why did I say that? Why did I do that? The safest thing for me to do was to point fingers and look back. As I healed and I got stronger, I was able to look at myself and go, oh man, why? I shouldn't. What can I do differently? It's a choice.
Yeah.
We have that choice. But we have to understand that we don't have to do things the way that they were taught to us. People can only give you what they were given. When you understand that and you can give people that grace and go, they didn't know any better. Now I do. And so I'm going to handle things differently. And sometimes handling things differently is not engaging. It's not forcing a relationship. It's not forcing a relationship. It's like, I understand that you're on your own journey. You've got your own cross to bear. I'm going to be over here. I'm going to love you from a distance. It's okay to do that. It's okay to still have, a familial connection, but keep people at a distance in order to protect yourself. And that's a personal boundary. A lot of times people talk about boundaries, and boundaries are, in your relationship with other people, but boundaries are most importantly the relationship you have with yourself and what you allow your mind to think about and ingest. We have the choice and we've got the power to decide. You just got to take that in and be patient with yourself and be kind and loving to yourself. Even if that feels awkward, even if that was not modeled for you, you've got to do it for yourself. And if you don't know how to do it, just like anything, if you don't know how to ride a bike, you get help. Learn how to do it from somebody else. Well, you don't know how to play chess, you find somebody that knows how to play chess and they teach you. The same comes from self-acceptance. Find someone that can do that. And it doesn't even have to be therapy. My healing guru was a coworker that became my best friend. She taught me everything. I just observed her. I initially led our relationship with my own stupid way of thinking. And I was so insecure. And I thought all these things that she was thinking about me. And I was like, but wait a minute, pause. She is completely unbothered by all my insecurities. She's so confident. I want to be confident too. I want to be her friend. And she's the one who introduced me to my very first therapist. And she is the one who still nurtures me to this day. I wasn't nurtured. I didn't realize that she was even nurturing me as a friend because I was never nurtured. So I thought of what she was doing as like, she thinks she's smarter than me. She's better than me. I could figure this out on my own. So much insecurity was coming out. And then I said, wait a minute, this is a good person. I want a good person in my life. Let me get curious and ask her how she got to where she got. And then as our friendship blossomed, I realized that we had damn near the same childhood. She just started healing earlier than me.
And it's not a race. And at the same time, it's like we're one person away, one person who can show us a better way to regulate our emotions, to deal with stress and change, from being able to figure out, as you put it, and I loved how you put it, who am I without all the pain? It's a process. That's a great way to talk about therapy in a nutshell, or to talk about your own healing journey. It's trying to understand, who are you really without all of the pain and all of the reactionary stuff that you do in response to that pain and the changes you've had. Really well said. Where can people, because I have a feeling people are going to want to read your book and know more about you. Where can people go to learn more about you and all the awesome work that you're doing?
Sure. Check out my website. My website is Melody, LMFT. So Melody, my first name, and LMFT stands for Licensed Marriage and Family Therapist.com. That's me on Instagram and on Facebook as well. I'm going to be on the Today Show again on September the 3rd, Tuesday, September the 3rd. Yeah, just check out my website. You can buy my book from there. The next one is coming out pretty soon. The first one's already on Amazon. The next one will be on Amazon as well.
Awesome. You'll find all of that stuff linked up in the show notes and the description box below this video or podcast, however you are consuming this. And listeners, watchers, this generational trauma thing, it is real. And it is more common than you think. And with the help of being honest with yourself, being curious about your background, forgiving yourself, forgiving others, and taking your own healing journey, it's also treatable. We'll see you on the next episode. This episode of Treatable was edited by Daniel Lopez. The intro and explanatory sections of the episode were written by Alexandra Kruger. The theme song was created by Sebastian Gonzalez, and the cover art for this episode is created by Joel Daniel. If you got any value from this episode, it would personally mean the world to me if you would leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps to spread mental health awareness to more folks, and I read each and every comment that people leave. So tell us what you appreciate about the podcast, and you just might hear us feature it on the next episode. All of my love, and we'll see you on the next one.